Hey y'all, we are the Stewarts. My husband, Russell, is an artist, and I am May, and I have an interest in true crime. We decided to merge our two interests together. Enjoy this calming visual while listening to a tragic story. This is Stewart and Crime. Imagine sleeping next to your wife, who is 5 months pregnant. And the house is peaceful and quiet, even with 8 children in the home. When you suddenly wake up to the sound of someone trying to break in the front door, and then all your children screaming and crying out in fear. This was the experience for Thomas Rodriguez on February 19th, 1971. He ran to the door, saw that it was open, and next thing he knew, he was shot in the arm and chest by police officers. How did this innocent family become the target of a police raid? Well, by mistake. Let's go back to the events that led up to this moment. It was February 15th, when 2 men were burglarizing a home. A neighbor saw the suspicious activity and took down the license plate number before the robbers took off, then called the police with the information. After finding out the address to the owner of the car, Officers Wendell Dover and A.J. Robertson drove to 2810 Ingersoll Street with an arrest warrant in hand. Officer Samuel Infante tagged along to be an interpreter in case the men did not speak English. Once at the residence, their 2 suspects, Rene Guzman and Leonardo Lopez, were found outside working on a car. This is when the officers spotted another car, a red and white 1962 Ford, the one reported as being involved in the burglary. The men were very cordial, and even let the officers in the home to use their phone to call for some consent to search forms. The men said the car in question had been left at their house, but they, themselves, were not involved in the robbery. Infante made the call to have the forms brought over, while Officer Dover went to feel the hood of the car to see if it was still warm. One of the suspects walked out with him, while the other stayed inside. Everything and everyone seemed relaxed during this whole interaction. And this may have been why the officers let their guards down. Because the officers would not be in control of this situation for long, and their lives would now be in the hands of 2 drug addicts. Once Infante got off the phone with the sheriff's office, he turned around to find Guzman and Lopez pointing guns at him and Officer Robertson. They were forced to turn over their weapons, sit in chairs, with their hands bound. As Dover checked the car, one of the men followed him, put a gun to his back, forced him to hand over his pistol, and escorted him back inside the house. Officer Dover was further discouraged when entering the house and saw both Officer Infante and Robertson sitting in chairs being held at gunpoint. Robertson told Dover to do as the men said, and he was also forced into a chair with his hands tied. They stayed this way while waiting for the other 2 officers to arrive, who were expected any minute with the search warrant. When Officer Reese and McCurley knocked on the door, they heard a voice say, "Come in." So they entered the house only to find their 3 fellow officers being held hostage. Next thing they saw were guns pointed at them from both sides, as Guzman and Lopez stood on either side of the door, both holding 2 guns each. They disarmed the officers and told McCurley to bound Reese's hands. He did as he was told, except he made the ties very loose in hopes that Reese would be able to get out of the bindings later. 5 officers sat in the living room just waiting to find out what the outcome of this situation would be. While waiting, a 3rd man came into the house. But after assessing the situation, he decided to leave and not be involved in what the men were doing. Guzman and Lopez decided the next course of action would be to get the officers out of the house. So they backed one of the patrol cars up the driveway and forced 4 of the officers in the back seat, and then untied Infante's hands and instructed him to drive. The 2 gunmen sat in the front seat, with one gunman having his weapon trained on the officers in the back, and the other held a gun to Infante. Following their orders, Infante drove to the Westmoreland Bridge, and then turned onto a dirt road that ran between the Trinity River and its levee. During this time, however, Infante tried 3 times, unsuccessfully, to ram passenger cars during the drive, but each time he had a gun shoved into his stomach. The gunmen spoke the entire trip in Spanish, so only Infante knew all of what they were saying. When they pulled up to the Trinity River, Infante said, "This is it. They're going to kill us now." Reese, who during the car ride was able to free his hands, pleaded with the men. "There's no reason to kill us now. You have our guns." To which they replied, "No, you can identify us." The men were all out of the car when Reese decided to make his move. He threw a punch at Guzman, but missed and was shot multiple times. At the same time, Infante attempted to tackle Lopez and was shot and killed. These distractions allowed Officer McCurley to make his escape as he threw himself over an embankment, rolling toward the river, and thankfully stopped before falling in. He had another stroke of luck as the rope bounding his hands were cut on a tree. He got up right away and took off running. He was able to make his way back to Westmoreland Road, flag down a car, and get a ride to a nearby gas station to call the police. While he was calling in backup, Dover and Robertson were still attempting escape. They took off running toward the road when Robertson saw the 2 gunmen jumping back into the car driving right towards them. He shouted to Dover, "They're going to run us down!" Both officers jumped down to the riverbank, but Robertson got there first and became cornered by the shorter of the 2 gunmen. However, noticing the gun was jammed, he yelled for Dover to come help him take this guy down. But before Dover could reach him, the taller gunman was running down the riverbank, holding 2 guns. Robertson yelled for them to run. Robertson was shot in the back, while Dover ran toward the squad car to try and get a gun for himself. He was shot and fell unconscious. Dover woke to find the gunman gone, and Robertson laying next to him. He was dead. He then checked on Reese and Infante. Both were also deceased. Officer Dover then made his way to Westmoreland Street. Around this time, an officer came and picked McCurley up from the gas station, and the 2 drove back to the scene of the crime, where they found Dover stumbling through a grassy area northeast of the shooting site. He had been shot in the chest and arm. McCurley and the officer picked him up and took him to Parkland Hospital. The next day, Rene and Moises Guzman were charged with the murder, as both their fingerprints had been found in the stolen police car. Moises was arrested later that day, but Renee was still on the run. So police set up a police search of cars passing through the Texas-Mexico border. February 18th, Moises was picked out of a lineup by Officer McCurley as the individual who entered the home and then left before the shootings. McCurley also stated that the other two men tried to convince him to join in, but he refused and left. This is Moises' written statement of that day. I arrived home on Ingersoll Street around 5:30 p.m. and was warned by my stepfather that there was trouble inside the house. I entered the home and saw Renee and a friend holding guns. I saw the officers tied down in chairs. I left the house immediately and walked half a block down the street, and did not return until I saw a car full of people leaving the house. I returned to the home and took 4 rifles and a television set, and using Renee's car, drove to a relative's house on Weisenbarger Street, where I was later arrested. Renee and Lopez were still not arrested at this time. But thanks to an informant, the police were getting closer to arresting the 2 men. This informant was connected to the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. And according to court transcripts, the informant explained that he had seen Guzman and Lopez that evening in a garage apartment at 4627 San Jacinto Street in Dallas. He told the officers that if they went to that address, they would find the suspects, and agreed to point out the house. 2 officers, Rose and Boyes, had previously acted on information received from the informant and considered him to be reliable. Sometime between 9:30 and 10 p.m. that night, Rose, with Boyes, in the front seat of the automobile, and the informant in the rear seat, drove to the San Jacinto Street address area. Rose drove slowly past the apartment building, back and forth, 3 times. Each time the informant pointed out a small garage apartment where he had said he seen Guzman and Lopez that evening. The apartment was located to the rear of a main apartment building. A light was on over the door of the rear apartment, and he said, "It's that apartment where the door is, where the light is on." He further remarked, "They are there. If you hit that place right there, you will get them." He also warned, "They have guns, and they are going to kill any policeman that comes after them." A police raid was issued on February 19th, with 60 officers participating, being led by Deputy Sheriff Lou Acker, former partner of Infante. They barricaded off the neighborhood and went in for the attack. On the wrong apartment. This brings us back to the story at the start of this episode. The accounts are different from Thomas Rodriguez and the police. The officers claim they knocked and announced themselves when someone shot at them, and that is when they returned fire. This is the rest of the Thomas Rodriguez account of the events that unfolded that evening. After he had been shot in the chest and arm, Thomas grabbed the gun he kept behind their sofa and took off running toward the kitchen, being shot in the leg in the process. This is when he shot back at his attackers, but did not know where the bullet went. But his wife, sitting in the living room, was shot in the leg. Thomas ran back to the living room and saw one of his sons holding his hands up and told him, "It's the police, Daddy. He says for you to put your hands up and get rid of and throw the gun down. You need to turn around and kneel down." Rodriguez listened. He was then handcuffed, and after about 30 minutes, he was taken to a hospital. He later stated, "He understands the English words open, door, police, stop, pistol, and hold it, but that the only sounds he had heard prior to entering the front room were shouts and screams." In a later interview with Pancho Medrano, a labor and civil rights activist, Thomas explained that after being arrested, he was never questioned by police outside the apartment or at the hospital, but claimed in the interview, "I only wished to protect my family, and that I was afraid," also stating he only knew Guzman from what he saw on the news. Neighbors corroborated his story by saying they never heard any warning before the shooting began. The raid on the Rodriguez apartment was no mistake, as we have evidence proving Rodriguez was a heroin supplier for Guzman and Lopez, stated Sheriff Clarence Jones following the shooting. However, no drugs were found in the Rodriguez apartment. Yet Thomas stayed in jail. His attorney demanded they either file charges against his client or retract their claims of Thomas being a drug dealer. Instead, the sheriff turned over the evidence to a grand jury. While awaiting the grand jury's decision, Thomas was given a bond of $1,000, which activist Pancho Medrano paid. They held a vigil for the family on March 6th. Sadly, out of fear, fewer than 100 people were in attendance for the event. On March 11th, Paul Marino, a state representative from El Paso, came to show his support and for the need for change in the community. On March 21st, Medrano organized a march in support of the Rodriguez family. That same month, a grand jury gathered to determine whether or not to indict Thomas Rodriguez on charges of assault to murder a police officer and the sale of heroin. A federal narcotics agent testified regarding the accusations. Rodriguez still was indicted. His attorney requested a speedy trial, and they also filed a $10,000 suit against Sheriff Clarence Jones, Dallas Police Chief Frank Dyson, and the deputies who had shot him. But all charges ended up being dropped against Rodriguez in 1972 after the judge dismissed the assault to murder charges, on the grounds that the documents were faulty, further explaining that one indictment failed to specify the year and the second wrongly identified a deputy sheriff as a Dallas policeman. The Rodriguez family also lost in their suit against the police department, with the judge stating, "The evidence showed that the officers were acting in good faith, with reasonable belief that two killers were on the premises when they forced their way into the apartment." The police did, however, apprehend Guzman and Lopez in a larger building in the apartment complex that same night. Two women, Alice Rosales and Angie Hernandez, were arrested that same evening for hindering the arrest of Guzman and Lopez by lying and saying no one else was in the apartment with them. But a police officer saw curtains move in the bathroom window, so they pushed past the two women and entered the apartment. They ordered Guzman and Lopez to surrender, and Guzman tossed out a pistol from the bathroom and surrendered. Lopez was removed from the bathroom and arrested. Within the apartment, police found two pistols, including Infante's .38 caliber service revolver. Guzman confessed to the shootings later that day, and Lopez wrote out his confession in a written statement 5 days after their arrest, stating that the whole thing was Guzman's idea, and that the reason they decided to stay in Dallas instead of fleeing was due to staying in town, close to their drug supplier. The trial began in June 1971, with Guzman and Lopez being tried together. The judge decided to move the trial to Belton, Texas because of all the publicity. The prosecution decided to try the men for the murder of Officer Robertson first because Dover was present in Robertson's death and could serve as a witness. Both Dover and McCurley testified at trial. Henry Wade, who was a part of the prosecution team, decided he would be the one to make the closing statements. Both men were found guilty and sentenced to death. Henry Wade was up for re-election and had decided it wouldn't hurt to have some free publicity, which is why he decided to give the closing arguments. Yet his statements were so full of inaccuracies and improper conduct that they partially helped Guzman and Lopez win their 1973 appeal and had the verdict thrown out. The other reason for their successful appeal was because of a Supreme Court decision in 1972 that ruled the death penalty unconstitutional. Their new trial started on February 18, 1974, for the murder of Robertson. They were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The trial for the murder of Don Reese began on April 2, 1974, and both men were sentenced to life in prison. April 3, 1974, the two men were put on trial for the murder of Samuel Infante and were sentenced to life in prison. And, after 16 attempts, Leonardo Lopez was actually deemed rehabilitated and was released on parole in 1991. However, after violating his parole, he was sent back to prison. He died on August 6, 2017. Rene Guzman is still in prison and the only person still alive from the tragic events that happened that night in 1971. Officer McCurley continued with the police department until he retired as a deputy sheriff in 1987. And in 1990, he was elected mayor of Murchison, Texas. He served for 2 terms. He died on September 21, 2001 in Tyler, Texas. Officer Dover recovered from his wounds and went on to become a police detective, then retired and became a mail carrier. He died on March 5, 2005 in Enos, Texas. Before I end this episode, I have a few more facts about this case that I would like to share with y'all. The police informant, Agapito Gonzalez, received a $1,000 reward for the information he provided on Guzman and Lopez. Unfortunately, he was murdered in June 1971. A man by the name of Celso Cantu was awarded $6,500 in 1972 for being illegally jailed as a suspect in the Trinity River Massacre. He had been arrested shortly after the murders and was held in solitary confinement for 8 days. 4 of those days were after Guzman and Lopez were arrested. Cantu originally sued Dallas County Sheriff Clarence Jones for $160,000, and during the trial, Jones told the jury that Cantu's imprisonment had been due to an administrative oversight. Prosecutor Henry Wade had been made famous for prosecuting the case against Jack Ruby in 1964. Jack Ruby was a Dallas nightclub owner who shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald just 2 days after Oswald assassinated President John F. Kennedy. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe button below. If you want to inquire about a commission, you can email Russell at russellstewart.art@gmail.com. You can watch Russell livestream his art on Twitch. And if you want to hear more true crime stories, you can subscribe to my podcast, Crimes of a Decade, a Texas true crime podcast. Now that we are done, make sure to wash with the brush. Just beat the devil out of it.